So when I was 10, my mom took us to Poland, and I wondered why we didn't go to the concentration camps, because they were like, right there. They were like within spitting distance.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom said to me that she didn't want to invite that evil into her life.
Yeah, your mom's kind of superstitious, isn't she?
She can be.
Yeah.
I don't know. But, my 10-year-old brain didn't understand, but as an adult, I kind of understand what she was saying. It's heavy. And when you're
I can get it.
Parenting a 4-year-old and a 10-year-old, I don't know if that's necessarily the best family vacation spot.
Yeah, probably not. I've always felt that history has a real kind of tangible effect on people and places, and it leaves like I guess you could call it like an aura. I'm not, particularly new agey or superstitious, so that's probably not the right word, but I guess you could call it like an aura. It's, whenever you're in a place with some kind of historical significance, whether that be personal or, societal, you can feel it,
Yeah.
It
leaves a lasting impact for sure.
Yeah, even if you don't fully know. I'm pretty sure I've told you this story before, but when I was in high school, I went to Monterrey, Mexico over the summer with some classmates. We were down there for a week, and we helped out at like an elementary school with some of the kids, helping them with like their English lessons and doing some, maintenance stuff. We helped, paint the new wing of a building that they had put up and stuff like that. But while we were there, we also got to kind of tour around the city and see some of the sites. And we went and looked at this really beautiful Catholic cathedral.
Yeah.
And I didn't know why at the time, but when I was there standing in the cathedral, there was just something about, like, it had this sort of ephemeral feeling to it.
Mm-hmm.
I later found out 20 years later, that was the cathedral where my great-grandmother was baptized.
What?
And I think that was probably what I was feeling, even if I didn't know it. There's just kind of that personal connection, and, history leaves an imprint, and you feel it.
Ghosts.
You're listening to Dot Femme.
Welcome to Dot Femme. I'm your host, Danielle Gonzalez.
I'm Claire.
And today we're going to be talking about Magnus Hirschfeld and the Institut for Sexual Science. Probably one of my favorite topics in LGBT history.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's
Interesting. What draws you to it?
We'll get into it as we start exploring this particular topic, but I've always just found this particularly interesting.
When did you first hear about this?
When did I first hear about this?
Yeah.
I think I first heard about this, I don't know, maybe 9 or 10 years ago. I don't think it's particularly well known, and for a very specific reason, as you'll see here shortly. But I do think it's so important to the history of our community. So
Take us back, Danny. Take us way back.
how about 1868? Does that feel way back enough?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess that's far
Okay.
enough.
So Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, or let's see if I can get my German right. Listeners, leave a comment and tell me if I pronounce this correctly.
They're viewers.
Yeah. Arzt Magnus Hirschfeld was born in 1868 in Prussia, the country of Prussia, which is modern day Poland. You're Polish, right?
Yeah, a little bit. Grandma Peplinski. Fun fact, Grandma Peplinski was gay. She had a roommate, and no one ever told me. God. Anyway.
Yeah, generational. So,
Go on, Danny.
Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, he was born in 1868 in modern day Poland. He was born to Jewish parents on the Baltic coast. This is something I didn't know until I did research for this particular episode, but he originally studied to be a linguist. He originally studied languages.
Nice.
Before he ended up switching field of study to medicine, and he obtained his doctorate in 1892.
Cool.
Yeah.
Linguistics is like a subsection of voice study, which it's what I want to learn, but don't have the time to dedicate to it. Anyway, if anyone wants to give me free linguist lessons, I will happily take you up on that offer.
In 1896, he moved to Berlin. At this time, Berlin was sort of undergoing this queer awakening of sorts. There was a pretty prominent gayborhood that had formed. A lot of different community groups began to form. One of my favorites that I learned about, I don't know a ton about them, but I just really like the name. It was a group of gay men, a community of gay men. They called themselves the Community of the Unique.
Ooh, Danny, we're unique.
We are unique. Well, I'm not a gay man, but we are unique. Yeah,
that's fair.
So there's this really kind of burgeoning LGBT community forming in Berlin around this time at the turn of the century. There were actually, I think in 1898, 1899, 1900, there were actually like 4 or 5 gay and lesbian bars in Berlin, and by like 1910 that number had exploded to like 40, which is it's pretty cool.
Are you saying that gay people have been around forever?
Yeah.
What? Oh my gosh.
Crazy.
Mind blown. That's cool though.
Yeah, I think it's really neat. So around this time, Dr. Hirschfield published a book called Sappho and Socrates: How Does One Explain the Love of Men and Women to Persons of Their Own Sex? And in this, he argued that homosexuality is biological, it's a naturally occurring phenomenon. And he quoted Friedrich Nietzsche by saying, "What is natural cannot be immoral." Was not expecting Nietzsche to show up here, but here he is. So,
yeah.
You know what else was happening around this time? Which was honestly kind of despicable, but for the purposes of this story, it's actually kind of important. Have you heard of human zoos? Did you know about these?
Is this like the freak shows that we've heard about?
No, this is way different than like Ripley's Believe It or Not. Believe it or not. These human zoos were these like, they were parts of these, cultural fairs of sorts. You can think of like, well, we live in Seattle, so we're exposed to like the Space Needle and the monorail from like the World Fair of like, what was that, 1964 or something like that?
Yeah.
But like these types of world fairs had all these different exhibits, these different, events. And one of them that was pretty common in a lot of these different cultural fairs were human zoos, where the, colonial governments of the time would kidnap and abduct, literally enslave, indigenous people from their far off colonies, and they would bring them in and put them on display in these human zoos. Really disgusting.
That's grotesque.
But one of the things that I didn't know about Dr. Hirschfield that I found interesting was in 1896, shortly after he came to Berlin, at a major culture fair in Berlin, they had a human zoo, and he goes and he talks with the indigenous peoples that are there, and he asks them about their culture and about how sexuality is expressed in their culture, in their homes. And it was really through this sort of discussion and really treating these people like equals, like people and not animals, that he really began to kind of learn about this wide spectrum of human sexuality and gender that we experience on this planet.
I was wondering how we were going to get to Magnus Hirschfeld here from human zoos. So I'm glad to hear that he took an interest in what was happening, an ethical interest.
Yeah. It was through these discussions that he began writing what would eventually become his book called The Homosexuality of Men and Women.
Damn.
Around this time, he's just moved to Berlin. There's this sort of explosion of queer culture and awakening happening in the city. And he becomes very actively involved in advocacy efforts on behalf of, sexual minorities. In fact, he founded the very first gay and lesbian organization in the world in 1897, a year after he moves to Berlin.
That's crazy.
It was called the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, and his sort of guiding philosophy, and actually it was the tagline of this organization, was justice through science. So he believed that sexual orientation was not a choice, and he thought that scientific understanding of, not just sexuality, but kind of human behavior in general would lead to wider tolerance and support for underrepresented communities, including sexual minorities.
Trans people. This is where the trans people come in.
Well, sort of, yeah. I mean, trans people were always here.
Oh.
We're living in your walls, baby. But yes, so his best known theory actually was, he called it the theory of sexual intermediaries, during which he stated that there were a lot of different types of naturally occurring sexual variations across the human population. In this theory, he talked about like hermaphroditism, which, you know, is an antiquated word, but like intersex conditions, homosexuality, transvestism, which was a term he coined actually. And actually, he not only did he coin the term transvestism, he also coined the term transsexual. And he sort of put them kind of together almost interchangeably. And he looked at these as, I guess for the time, the way he described it would, he would, you know, describe it as severities, right? So like you would have transvestism or cross-dressing, and then you would have extreme transvestism, transsexualism, which would be, you know, like trans folks like you and me, I guess.
I feel like we could start describing ourselves like, oh, I'm an extreme transgender, thank you.
Extreme.
That's right.
Yeah. And you have to keep in mind, this is 1897, 1900-ish. So, like, the modern understanding of the word transgender doesn't exist yet. That word won't show up until, like, 1970, right? So, when Dr. Hirschfield talks a lot about transvestism, oftentimes he's referring to the transgender community, but we just don't have that word yet.
Right.
At this time, and stop me if this sounds familiar, Claire, a lot of people objected to his conceptualization of sex, gender, and orientation existing on a spectrum, because there were a lot of queer folks that were offended by the notion of being associated with, quote, gender nonconformity. There were a lot of gay men that argued that male-to-male love was just a demonstration of virile manliness and the purest form of masculinity in, like, the great Greek tradition.
Oh my God. So are you saying that in the 1900s Germany...
that misogyny was alive and real?
that too. But that there's still, like, the idea of binary is still, like, large and prevalent here? Because, like...
Oh, yeah.
You know, like, you say, like, gender nonconformity. That's, like, that idea in and of itself is a massive leap from someone who has just now, like, learned that trans people exist. That shows that there's, you know, as they called it, sexual intermediaries. Like, you know, it's a spectrum. I don't know. I find it really fascinating that Magnus Hirschfeld, within like the span of 5-6 years, something like that, discovers trans people exist, and then he's like, there's nuance.
Well, yeah,
like,
and I mean, I don't think it was just trans people. And it, again, like, this is very pre-modern day concept of trans folks. So
yeah,
back then, he was looking at, let's use trans women as an example. He was looking at trans women as just hyper effeminate gay men who liked to dress as women, right? Because that delineation hadn't really become clear yet. Even then, you know, he still had this theory, this concept in just interacting with people that seemed to be born out of fact that all of this, you know, human expression was on a spectrum. You know, he was really kind of ahead of his time, especially on account that we still can't come to a consensus on that today. We're still arguing this point today.
Yeah.
So Magnus Hirschfeld, he's really kind of working with the LGBT community, engaging in a bunch of activism. He creates the Scientific Humanitarian Committee. Through this, they're doing all kinds of stuff. One of the things that he's really, you know, kind of leading the charge on is trying to gather enough signatures to repeal and overturn paragraph 175, which was part of the Weimar Republic German constitution that criminalized gay sex, right?
Oh.
And through his leadership, the committee gathered like 6,000 signatures from prominent, like well-known Germans.
You know how prominent, Danny? Fucking Einstein.
Einstein signed that.
Einstein signed
Tolstoy signed that.
Ooh.
Pretty cool.
That is pretty cool.
You know, he really, through his work, he really kind of ingratiated himself into the community. And he kind of found himself through the community, too. I don't know if I couldn't find anything that definitively stated whether he identified as gay or not, but he did have a life partner. Nice. They were a well-known couple in the community. He had this I hear this and it just warms the cockles of my gay heart. But he had this wonderful nickname in the community. They called him Tante Magnesia. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm probably not, but I think I am. But it's, from my understanding, Tante it was like German slang for auntie, essentially. So they like Auntie Magnus, Auntie,
Aww,
I really liked that.
That's cute.
I think it's very sweet.
Aw. That just gave me so much like framing for who Magnus Hirschfeld was.
Right.
Because like, you hear this name, you hear the, like this guy who's got a library and stuff. And, you're like, okay, why does he do this? Like on whose direction, on whose accord? And, like obviously so far we've learned that it's on his own accord through his own self-discoveries. But then, you start to find out that everyone calls him like auntie. Mm-hmm. Like, that's adorable.
Yeah,
like it really gives you an idea of his character.
And I think, whether it was he felt himself as part of the community, whether through being like just a close ally or whether he himself did identify as gay, I don't know. But I think also part of it was just he saw people as people, and he had this thirst for knowledge and scientific understanding and a passion for justice. And those things, came together. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why he did what he did. He did a lot of really kind of interesting and groundbreaking things. Here's a really good example. So at this time in Germany, being gay, like gay sex is illegal, right? But female impersonation, cross-dressing, isn't technically illegal. Not like it was in America during Compton's, like we talked about last time. The police weren't just scooping up trans women and arresting them because they were wearing the wrong shirt, right? However, trans women and trans people in general were being arrested a lot. They weren't charging them with female impersonation, obviously. They were charging them with like disruption of the peace or prostitution, crazy over-sexualized misconceptions that still persist to this day. Mm-hmm. But in an effort to kind of curtail this sort of frivolous arrests of trans people in the trans community, he created what was called the transvestite pass, where he worked with the police to provide a piece of documentation saying that so-and-so individual was to use his terminology of the time, transvestite, and that they were dressing to live their authentic selves, and they were, working with him, like therapy, very similar to the kind of letters that like we have to get from doctors for like hormone replacement therapy.
Are you telling me that things haven't changed in 100 years?
Things have changed, but slowly.
All right.
But you can see how he was kind of like breaking ground very early on. So, in fact, one of the very first people to receive a transvestite pass was this trans woman, Gerda von Zobeltitz. I think I've said her name correctly. I hope so.
That's a name.
It really is. It probably sounds much better in like a genuine German accent, which I do not have. I'm sure we'll talk about her in a later episode because she herself was fascinating. But she received a transvestite pass.
Cool. I've never heard of her before, so yeah. I would love to. This sounds great.
Yeah. Anyway, so 1919, Dr. Hirschfield founds the Institut für Sexualwissenschaft.
Let's go, baby. There it is.
Roughly translated to the Institute for Sexual Science or Sexual Research. There's a lot of debate on what the actual English translation is. And it was a nonprofit foundation and private research institute. It was the very first in the world that was dedicated to the study of sexology. In addition to just being a research institute, it had a big library. It had a massive archive, medical research, and images. They had psychiatrists on staff, neuroendocrinologists on staff, public educators, even dermatologists, radiologists.
What?
The Institute really kind of studied this holistic approach of science, the science of sex, right? Not just queer issues, but stuff that was helpful for everybody. Contraception, STDs, women's emancipation, and like the right to vote, that kind of stuff.
Wow.
So it was like this really kind of important cultural center.
I feel like that's like far left. Like that's far left for that time.
Well, it was pretty far left, but then again, during like the Weimar Republic period of Germany, they were pretty, like there was a lot of, kind of socially progressive stuff happening.
That's cool.
The Institute was just groundbreaking. They offered early forms of hormone replacement therapy, bottom surgeries, top surgeries. The surgeon on staff, Ludwig Levy-Lenz, even implemented, I think he formulated this procedure, but He implemented an early form of facial feminization and facial masculinization surgery.
What?
I know, right?
Okay, this right here is an episode on its own.
Probably.
Like the history of like trans surgeries and whatnot.
Oh, yeah.
Because like I had no idea that it was going back to like 1919. I had no idea it was that far. That's incredible.
If you thought that was crazy, they also even offered a very early version of what we today would call laser hair removal. But instead of using lasers, because lasers hadn't been invented yet, they used the Institute's X-ray facility.
You just remove an hair with cancer, you know?
Yeah, so I don't know if it
it
caused cancer, but it did have some side effects. And one of the side effects that they talked about was it caused some
That's crazy.
like mild skin burns.
Oh
but
my
like
God.
still, like they're really kind of pioneering this kind of stuff.
Yeah, they are. That's awesome. That's crazy.
Fascinating.
Wow.
And so from the 1920s onward, not only are they doing this really groundbreaking research for sexual science and also just the queer community, the conservative right is really kind of on the rise. The Nazi Party is really kind of on the rise. Dr. Hirschfield, he becomes a target of the far right in Germany.
Of course.
He was attacked multiple times, multiple assassination attempts. Once after he was shot at, one of the nationalist papers reported after the attack that it was, quote, regrettable that he hadn't died.
Oh.
He was really kind of going through it, but he persisted. You know, he believed in the vision that was the Institute and helping people. So he really worked on it.
I'm feeling for anti-Hirschfeld.
Yeah, me too.
You know? Like, he's just out there trying to help people, you know, give people hot soup, and then next thing you know, someone's shooting a bullet at him.
That's right. There's a lot of parallels between, Dr. Hirschfield's life and the Institute and what we're seeing today.
Not a good time.
In May of 1933, the Institute is broken into and looted by the German Student Union, who had really kind of bought into this Nazi nationalist message and platform. Does that sound familiar?
It does, but do we know, like, if there was a college associated with the student union, or, like, do we know much about the student union?
I'm sure we do. My guess is it was probably the Humboldt University of Berlin, because that was the university in Berlin where the Institute was located.
Interesting.
They broke into the Institute in the early hours of the morning. They had a brass band accompany them to play music while they broke in and looted the place. Crazy behavior.
Yeah, they saw it as a party. You know, they saw it as something worth celebrating. Like,
exactly.
You know, complete like erasure of an entire minority group, and they're sitting here saying, "Yeah, this is the best day ever. I can't believe we've done this."
And we see this type of thing happen in all kinds of authoritarian government rise to power. You know, Mao Zedong did it in China when he rose to power. Obviously, we're talking about it now with Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. A few days after the Institute is looted, members of the student union return with Nazi party officials. They, go through the remaining items in the library in the Institute, and they drag them out into the street and they burn them. It's actually one of the very first public book burnings that happened in Berlin. And it wasn't just stuff from the Institute. There were books by like Jewish authors that were thrown on the pyre and so on and so forth. But
just gone. Yeah, it's just gone. Setting us back, 70 years,
Yeah. I don't know if you do this too, but when I think of like Nazi book burnings, my mind always pictures the scene from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where they have to sneak into Berlin to steal back Indiana Jones's dad's research journal.
Half the German army's on our tail, and you want me to go to Berlin? Into the lion's den? Yes.
You look at that book burning, and like, it's pretty big, but some of these got massive. And to sort of put this into perspective, between 12,000 and 20,000, some estimates even say 25,000 books and journals were destroyed. And that was just books and journals. There was a much larger number of like images and artwork, rare medical and anthropological documents, charts concerning cases of intersexuality, which were supposed to be given and presented at an international medical congress like a week later, all destroyed in this book burning.
Wow. I wonder how much of those articles have actually been like salvaged, or like were presented or copied by another like group. Like we always hear about like the amount that was destroyed. But like now I'm curious about how much of it was saved, and if it was saved, where did it end up?
So I think I have a small number for you because I did find this, and I don't remember if this is correct, but I want to say like 50.
Wow.
Like 50 pieces of this research exist to this day. 50 out of 25,000.
Wow.
Nazis. I hate these guys.
I frequently have folks constantly being like, this is a fad. It didn't used to be this way when I was a kid, 50 years ago, yada, yada, yada. This is why.
Yeah.
This is the type of thing that happened that keeps us in the dark. Like, this is why people don't know about this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. Imagine how much further ahead in not just like LGBT healthcare, but just general human healthcare we would be if this stuff had been preserved.
Oh yeah, massively so. Yeah, they're just, trans, any sexual type, of study, any sexual type of research is the word I'm looking for. Any sexual type of research, it just contributes to the greater good of society. Like, it doesn't matter like the gender of the person that is being studied. The outcome of said research can help everybody. And so just to completely like destroy 20,000 pieces of research is despicable.
After this raid, after this book burning, they talked about it in the headline. It was big. It was a big event. They declared the Institute had a, quote, un-German spirit, and that it was, and get this, because we hear this a lot right now, that it was a threat to the German birth rate.
Oh, yeah. We've been hearing a lot about that lately.
A lot about that.
Yep.
Yeah. So after the raid, the Institute was forced to close. Obviously, this is actually the beginning of a much larger purge of what the Nazis called the purge, the homophile purge of gay men, especially in public life, but especially in the ranks of the Nazi party. They were rooted out and straight up killed in the Night of the Long Knives.
Wow.
Shortly after this, they started enacting very horrifically strict laws on homosexuality. They would round up gay men, which, again, remember, when we talk about like gay men at this time, there's not yet a clear delineation between gay men and trans women. So not only did they round up gay men, but they rounded up trans women too.
Yeah.
And they were sent to the death camps, the concentration camps. A lot of historians suspect that the way that the Nazis were able to find so many of these gay men and trans women was through the medical documents that they seized at the Institute when they raided it.
Wow.
Really kind of scary stuff.
Yeah.
Hirschfield survived. In fact, when this happened, he was in Paris for, I think, a medical conference. And so he just kind of stayed there. He stayed in Paris, kind of in exile. He tried to reestablish the Institute in Paris in 1933, but he dissolved it a year later in 1934 just because it didn't gain traction.
Do you know anything else about that? Because, as a business owner myself, I'm like, if something doesn't gain traction, and I don't know, I have a lot of passion for what I do, but, I'm going to push like hell to try to make it happen. And he saw obviously great success in Germany. Like, the way, obviously he needs other practitioners to do this work. Like, he needs a community of people to do this work.
Right.
And I don't know, this is just purely speculation, but it feels like to me, it says after it failed to gain traction, that people were just a little cautious.
Well, it's kind of how the Democratic Party is treating trans folks right now, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. Do you know what he did after this?
I do. He died a year after this.
Really? Oh, so he was just getting old. Yeah. Okay.
He died in Nice, France in 1935. I think he fought as long and as hard as he could, but there's only so much you can do before time catches up with you. When he passed away and when the Institute formally dissolved, the charter that the Institute was founded on had specified that in the event of any kind of dissolution, all of the assets were to be donated to the Humboldt University of Berlin. And in his personal will, he left all of his personal assets to his two life partners, Karl Giese and Li Shu Tong.
Are you telling me he was poly as well?
So, fun fact, for a brief period of time when he lived in exile, his two life partners, Karl and Li, lived with him in I think it's been described as an uncomfortable throuple.
Good.
I think shortly after he died, Karl fled to Czechoslovakia and Li Shutong fled to America. His will said to leave his assets to his two partners so that they could continue his work. But unfortunately, the German courts in 1935 decided that the seizure of Hirschfield's property by the Nazis was totally legal.
Wow.
So they failed to carry out his will, and nothing was left to either of them, and his work was never continued. It's not all completely bad news. Today, on the ground where the Institute stood, they built what's called the House of World Cultures, which is this large complex that's dedicated to various world cultures. But it includes a bar called the Hirschfield Bar, named after him.
Nice.
In 1973, a new Institute for Sexual Science was opened at the University of Frankfurt am Main, in the spirit of the original one.
Woo!
And in 1996, at the Humboldt University in Berlin, they opened an Institute for Sexual Science, finally fulfilling Magnus Hirschfeld's final wishes and the original Institute's charter. So, this episode of Dot Femme is supported by our Patreon, duh. I mean, come on, you think a tiny trans podcast like us would have sponsors? I wish. No, we're supported entirely by our listeners. We're kind of like PBS that way, only queerer. Patreon.com/dotfemme. That's patreon.com/dotfemme.
So, Danny, do you know anything about this Lily Elbe lady?
Lily Elba?
Yeah, Elba.
I don't know a ton. She was... Okay. Was she Danish? Dutch?
I don't know. I don't know anything about her. We'll definitely have a podcast about her in the future.
I think we will. I know she was pretty important. I believe she was one of the first recipients of gender reassignment surgery.
Oh, that's amazing.
I do know the biopic, the Danish Girl, starring Eddie Redmayne, is about her.
Oh. Well, the reason that I asked about Lily was because there's a bar in the House of World Cultures named after Hirschfield. And apparently there's a garden.
Yeah.
And what made me think about this is that you and I have talked at length about opening a lesbian bar.
Yes, we have.
You say reluctantly.
No, not reluctant.
Look, okay.
Look, at this point, I'm unemployed. Let's fucking do it.
I think it'd be really, really good for us to do that.
I'd really be down, actually.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, like if the Wild Rose was like, we need to sell this and get a new owner, I'd be like, I'm down. I'm totally in it. For our viewers, in Seattle, there's a skate bar called the Wild Rose. It's been around forever. And it's one of the oldest lesbian bars in the country.
It was the first lesbian bar on the West Coast, I think.
It was really?
I think so.
Fascinating. Yeah. And there's only one in Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
But there's kind of there's another lesbian bar that's kind of a lesbian bar, but not really a lesbian bar. Anyway, it's in Ballard and it's a sports bar, so it's for all the jockey lesbians. But anyway, if you're in the know, you're in the know.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. But anyway, the Wild Rose is a staple for lesbians in the community, and so anyway, we should open a bar.
Yes, we should. So you remember when the president gave his joint speech to speech to joint sessions of Congress, and he was talking about how there was like $8 million being spent to make mice transgender?
Yes. I just recently ran across a video that was totally misquoted and not even what they are doing. You want to fill us in, Danny?
They released the scientific research studies that they were referencing to make this decision. And I read all of them. I think only 2 were actually about, like, for the benefit of actually about trans healthcare. Most of them only mentioned transgender people as a way to isolate for sex as a variable, because it's a natural population with which you can do that. And most of the research was for like child cancer, child asthma, STDs in like women in general, like stuff that could absolutely benefit the trans community. Like I have asthma, but like it's not trans focused, right? But there were 2 studies didn't have the word transgender.
Yes!
It said transgenic mice.
Yes.
And those mice are very common in all kinds of scientific studies. Those are mice that have had their genes manipulated to be more human-like. That's all that means.
Yep.
So very clearly you could tell that like a 19-year-old at the government went Control F, typed in trans, hit enter,
Yep.
and printed these like 8 studies.
Yep. It's just completely false information. That's the kind of things that's being spoken about on the House floor right now.
Yep.
So sometimes I disappear and I play video games. In Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, I found myself in a dungeon. Well, good news, viewer. I escaped the dungeon.
Oh, good.
And spoiler alert, skip ahead like 3 seconds. Hans didn't die. I saved the person and everything is fine. And now I have a new horse.
I'm sure our listeners were on the edge of their seat waiting to see what would happen in Kingdom Come Deliverance 2.
So anyway, that's what I do when I don't want to go to the news. Live in the fantasy medieval world that has swords and horses. It's called self-care, Danny. Self-care.
You know what my self-care has been lately?
Ooh, what's your self-care?
Yesterday, I woke up with Enemy by Imagine Dragon, you know, the theme song to Arcane, stuck in my head.
Yep.
And Riot Games released like the full opening titles version of that track on Spotify, and I've just been listening to it on repeat.
Ooh.
It really kind of captures what it feels like to be underrepresented, but you know, in my case, like trans.
Oh yeah.
It's kind of turning into like my fight song, my warrior song.
What do you think of the rap section in the middle?
It's pretty fun. I wish I could rap, but I can't.
It is pretty fun. I do enjoy it, but from a musical perspective, I don't like. It feels like it separates you from the song, and like it's a different beat, and I don't know. It just pulls me out of it. But I appreciate everything around it. But just like strictly from a musical perspective, I wish they would have chosen a different rhythm.
Well, I've listened to it enough that I think the very first 2 bars of that section fit the rhythm. And then it begins to speed up, and then it breaks, you know, it slowly breaks the rhythm until it's kind of this frenetic, like, and I think that speaks to sort of like the resistance, fight back against the power kind of message of the song.
Oh, that's a good point.
Because like the refrain has this like constant sort of almost like a march beat to it, right? You know, everyone marching together and fighting, but it's like there's that one part where it's like he kind of stands up above the crowd and really kind of like spits his bars to energize everyone, and then it comes back fully orchestrated for like the last part of the song.
Good way of looking at it.
I actually really like it.
Yeah, it's a great tune. So anyway, we're watching Arcane, viewer. It's been nice. Danny's watched the whole thing, but I am in the middle of near the end of season 2, actually. I think we've only got like 2 episodes left. So anyway, the next episode, we're going to be talking about Arcane and all the ways in which it emulates modern society. We're not going to talk about the video game, though. We're going to totally forget about that because that's not important. Thanks for listening. I'm Claire.
I'm Danny.
Wait, really? That's how you're going to end it? You're not going to correct me on anything that I just said?
I'll cut you out in post. Remember, if you like this episode and you like what we do here, you can find us on our website, find us on Spotify, YouTube, TikTok. If you really want to support us so that we can continue to bring you this fantastic trans history content, support us on our Patreon. Give us all your money, but not, you know, just what you can spare.
Yep.
Anyway, I'm Danny.
I'm Claire.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.
Bye.